Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Baer, and tonight we have guest Chris Aubuck with us, author, researcher, and aerial phenomena expert. Mr. Aubuck has authored 3 books on the subjects of UFOs and out-of-place artifacts. Back in 2003, Chris co-founded a remarkable collaboration network of librarians, students, and scholars of paranormal history on the internet. It extends from North and Central America to Russia and Germany. It has accumulated thousands of references, searched media archives in several languages, and gathered hundreds of rare documents, scientific reports, and newspaper clippings from the last 400 years. Authoring Return of Magnolia, Wonders in the Sky, and OOPArts, tonight we will be discussing much of the UFO phenomenon that's taken place over the past few hundred years. We're going to get into personal experiences and eyewitness accounts. Chris brings forth a thought-provoking, paradigm-shattering presentation. Now, Chris is working on a new book that's coming out late June in Spanish, and it's going to be on teleportation, time travel, and some other really cool phenomena. So you can find Chris and his work at www.chrisaubeck.com. Hey, it's great to have you on the show with us here at the Leak Project, Chris. How's it going?
Hey, hi. Very well, and how are you?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic. Just really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you. I've gone through your books, and you've just got so much information out there. And I like how you've compiled data over the past several hundred years, because a lot of people just kind of focus on the past, I would say 60, 70 years ever since Roswell. And there's so many things out there around the world that point to, space travel, UFOs, flying saucers. So definitely going to get into this. But if you would, real quick for us, Chris, just give us a little description about yourself and why you decided to go down this path.
Okay, well, I'm English. I was born in London. I moved to Spain at the age of 19, and I've been here ever since. I'm currently living in the south of Spain, where I don't have a job, but that does mean that I'm able to research more ancient cases and to do some more investigation into what mainly interests me, which are very old UFO cases, anything from 1947 and before, plus archaeological mysteries. I've always been very interested in those. And my perspective on all of this is really that of a historian of the field. I'm not so bothered whether I'm looking at real data, real cases, actual UFOs, and so on. I'm more interested in the sociological impact that all of this has had over the decades, because in fact, if you look back in time at the topic of ancient astronauts, for example, we've been talking about the possibility that aliens visited the Earth since the early 19th century. And the idea that UFOs could be extraterrestrial in origin has been discussed since the middle of the 19th century too. So what I'm interested in is looking at the roots of ufology, the roots of other Fortean phenomena, including archaeological anomalies, and just trying to see what impact that has had on people.
If you were to look at all the data and evidence that you've got with UFOs, how far back are one of the oldest pieces of evidence that points to flying saucers?
Well, we have to distinguish, of course, between flying saucers and UFOs, which are very different animals indeed. But the earliest stories about unidentified flying objects, you can find them in, even in Sumerian texts, you can find them in cuneiform on tablets from Mesopotamia, because they discuss, or at least they list, they catalog certain kinds of astronomical anomalies, such as dark meteors. We all know that meteors are very bright-looking things that fly across the sky. The idea that one of them could be dark, or we could think there goes a black one late at night, is a strange concept. So that would technically be a UFO. It would be an unidentified flying object, and we're talking about 5,000 years ago. But if we look back to the earliest Roman chronicles, some Greek writings, and then, of course, later on in the medieval period, we find that scribes were constantly making note of strange things that they saw in the sky, which, of course, they said were visions or omens of God's anger, or maybe because God supported a side in a war, in a battle situation. He was indicating this with some kind of sign in the clouds. So it's a very old subject, and it doesn't matter which period in history you look at, you can normally find some indication that people were confused by things that they saw in the atmosphere. It doesn't always mean that these were UFOs in the sense that we hope they exist today as extraterrestrial or interdimensional objects, but it certainly indicates that people have always been obsessed with this subject going back thousands of years.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because there is certainly a difference between flying saucers and UFOs. And that was one of the reasons I asked that question. We had Stanton Friedman on here a while back. He was the first civilian investigator for Roswell. And I did bring up UFOs with him once. He said, well, let's make sure we're talking about the right thing. You know, flying saucers are completely different from UFOs. So I'm definitely glad you mentioned that. Now, I have seen old Renaissance paintings that looks like there's flying saucers in them. You know, not just UFOs, but actually disc-shaped spaceship-looking things. Have you noticed the same anomalies?
Well, there are Renaissance paintings. There are a lot of religious paintings which seem to depict flying saucers or UFOs of some kind. However, none of these cases really interest me, or they're not really cases. This is the problem. We're looking at depictions of, normally it's religious symbols. We're normally talking about something that had its own artistic evolution. If you look back in time at how these objects, why they were painted into religious pictures, you normally find that they were stylistic versions of an eye, or of a circle of angels, or just a halo, something like that. So I don't really trust who talk about UFOs in ancient religious paintings, because once you look at the origin of these symbols, or of these depictions, you realize there's nothing really ufological about them. There's a very good web page by an Italian art expert called Duochi, I think his name is. I don't remember how to spell it. I'll look that up. And he goes into great detail talking about the explanation for these supposed anomalies in religious paintings. And I would recommend anyone to check out his website. So I personally don't believe that religious paintings have anything to do with UFOs.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I've definitely seen some pictures that make me go, wow, that looks like a flying saucer or some type of disc-shaped thing. But I can see what you're saying. One of the things, too, that I found interesting with some of these old Renaissance paintings was, like, for one, as an example, Jesus is on the cross, and then on each side of him, there's these, what looks like, you know, little like discs or spaceships or something like that. And then I saw this one painting of this lady was like inside of her house or whatever doing something, and then there's this disc-shaped anomaly that's got a beam that literally goes directly to her. So I mean, that's kind of why I put that connection there, but I haven't done enough research into the religion, shapes and symbols and such. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Let me just let me just tell your listeners that the webpage which I'm referring to, it was built by this art expert, and he's also interested in ufology. He's an Italian researcher called Diego Cuoghi. I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but his surname is Cuoghi. And the website is at www.sprezzatura.it. And I wouldn't be recommending a foreign language website if it wasn't very good. And it really is a very good place to check out. And it's also got an English translation of his research, and it's spelled SPREZZATURA.IT. So if anyone wants to look into the connection between ufology and religious paintings, I'd go straight to that webpage.
And if we were to go back to the Magonia, is that how it's pronounced?
That's right. Magonia was a fabled place in French folklore where some strange airships had been sent from at some point, and the idea was the ancient, well, the French people, like the peasants, the farmers, and so on, around the 5th century in Europe, believed that there was a strange land called Magonia, where there was a race of either giants or magical beings who could send airships through the sky and invade their territories. And this is the word which Jacques Vallée used in his groundbreaking book, Passport to Magonia. Passport to Magonia, of course, refers to the idea that by looking into folklore, you can embark figuratively on one of these airships and see the world from the point of view of the aliens or the magical beings.
So is that what you personally believe, that there's been ETs or, advanced people that have traveled here and other places for thousands of years?
Well, I don't really have a personal theory about this. I've never seen enough evidence to indicate that we're being visited by aliens. I've never seen any proof that's really convinced me that this is what's going on. I think physical proof is lacking. I think that anecdotal proof or anecdotal evidence is very interesting. There are a lot of fascinating stories about encounters with otherworldly creatures. So I don't know what it all means. But as I said, because I'm interested in the human impact of the phenomenon or the phenomena, which is what I personally believe. I think that UFOs are not one simple phenomenon. I think that we're talking about a myriad of different causes and stimuli. I think that I don't know. I can't put my finger on a single theory to help explain it all, but I haven't yet come to the personal conclusion that we're being visited by aliens. God knows what's really happening. I mean, really, if we are being visited by Jupiterians who are here to do some shopping and eat us, that's fine too. I'm happy to believe that we're being visited if the evidence comes to light.
Now, when you put together some of these cases, would you walk us through maybe the top 5 experiences or cases that you've researched that make you go, wow?
Well, I'm going to tell you some of the stories which are in Return to Magonia, which is a book that I co-authored with a man called Martin Schoff. He's a great friend, great colleague, and he's got an excellent scientific brain to look into all the different ins and outs of historical cases, which together we've been analyzing using a wide range of technological resources as well as genealogical resources, because these days you can study historical cases just as you can study modern ones, because you have access to all the instruments that science provides. For example, we can calculate the positions of the stars and the planets, the sun, the moon. We can get information about the meteorological conditions at any point in history. We have access to all this kind of information. So when we look at historical cases, we think that they're just as good as modern ones half the time. I'll tell you about some of these. For example, one case in our book, Return to Magonia, refers to Stralsund, which is a German city, which in April 1665 became the scene of what seems to be like the description of a flying saucer. In fact, the reports mention ships, flocks of birds, fire and smoke in the sky, but there was also a dark plate or hat-shaped object that hovered over a church for an hour. And there are plenty of witnesses in this case, including several fishermen who afterwards complained of physical problems, including trembling and pain in their hands and feet, which is something that has happened since in some UFO cases. Witnesses have complained of physical ailments. And what we found is that contemporary illustrations made of the sighting were pretty good. And when you combine this with the time and the date, we can get a pretty good idea of what was going on in the sky at the time. And we can rule out all kinds of possibilities. For example, we know that it wasn't the sun or the moon seen through clouds. It wasn't Mars or Venus. It certainly wasn't sundogs. We're talking about an actual object in the sky, a plate-shaped object. We also discussed the possibility it could be a flock of starlings, but it just remained there for far too long. So it's probably the earliest sighting of a disc-shaped object that we've come across, and that's from April 1665. Then if we look at, for example, a story from August 1829, it's quite interesting. A group of people in Leeds in England saw what they thought was the full moon until it separated into 2 halves right above their heads. And then 2 humanoid figures came out and started floating in the sky for about an hour. And then the moon sort of repaired itself, the figures went inside again, and this whole vision disappeared. So these are stories which they could come out of a UFO magazine talking about very recent sightings, but these are 100, 200 years old. This book that we published, Return to Magonia, contains about 20 cases like this that we personally investigated, to the best of our ability, using computers, old books, genealogical resources, and so on. And we came to the conclusion that, well, these really do seem to have been anomalies, and very difficult to explain otherwise.
And are there certain locations that tend to see more of these anomalies, in England or Southeast Asia or Antarctica?
Well, we'd like to look into cases from Asia. Unfortunately, most of them haven't been translated into English yet. So unless we study Chinese, Japanese, and so on, we would sort of have a lot of trouble in information about what's being seen over there. It's easy to reach the conclusion that more phenomena has been seen, or at least reported, in the United States or in Great Britain or in Australia, Canada, simply because more newspapers and books from those countries have been digitalized. So it gives the impression that there's a lot more data from countries where they speak English. But of course, this is not the case. I live in Spain, where very few of the local newspapers have been digitalized so far. So we've no idea what's been going on here for the last few centuries. Now, we do have access to French sources, to Dutch sources, German, but for example, I don't speak German, so I rely on colleagues to send me information about what's going on there. So it's very difficult to say whether one country or another has had more reports of this kind.
Another thing too that fascinates me is just kind of over the years I've noticed the phenomena changes. So it must have an impact on the human psyche, like you're saying. And have you noticed that it has changed a lot over the past few hundred years, like the sightings of what people see, the actual shapes and structures?
Well, I think that what I've seen is that people have reported the things that they don't understand in different ways over time. So in the past, people have thought that maybe these were spirits or witches or ghosts or demons. And when they described the objects that they saw, they often said they had horns, or they breathed fire, or they could see bat wings, or, this kind of thing. Or if it was a witch, maybe they'd say that they saw the witch's hair or the nose, and so on. So I don't think personally that the phenomena have evolved in any way. I think that people's ability to describe what they see has evolved to a certain extent. These days, we have more terminology available to us, more cultural references, more knowledge in general about I don't know, how to express abstract ideas or how to describe things that we've never seen before than our ancestors did. So, for example, the word comet itself basically just means sort of a hairy shape. The word comet comes from the same etymological origin as the word comb, like from when you're combing your hair. So the original Greek word for comet sort of described a hairy head floating in the sky, but they didn't believe it was a hairy head, of course. But the idea is that before, vocabulary was a little bit more limited to describing things that had never been experienced before, and this sometimes gives the impression that the phenomenon has evolved. I just think it's people's ability to describe things that has evolved over time.
Also, you've seen some really cool anomalies from around the world that just kind of don't fit with the timeline or the location. And I was wondering if you could walk us through some of those as well.
Are you referring to UPARTs?
Yes, I am.
Right. Well, I've always been very interested in the ancient astronaut theory. I have to admit at this point that exactly the same with UFOs, although I've collected a massive amount of information, I've investigated a huge number of cases, and I have a very open mind. UFOs have never convinced me in any sense that I've never been really convinced that we're talking about actual visitations from anywhere. I'm interested in the phenomenon. I don't know what it means, if it means anything at all. When we're talking about archaeological artifacts, I'm also very interested in the possibility that we were visited in ancient times by beings outside the Earth. So I've always sort of had an open mind to this idea, the old Eric von Daniken theory, the possibility that our ancestors encountered alien beings. But again, I've never found enough evidence to indicate that. But what I did was, with a friend of mine, a colleague called Juan José Sánchez Oro, who's a historian of the prestigious Complutense University in Madrid, here in Spain, we worked together on a book to collect as many as much information as we could about all these typical artifacts which you see on TV programs like Ancient Aliens, to analyze them from the point of view of serious historians, and to publish them as a kind of guide for people to understand better whether these artifacts are real, whether there are indications that either superior races to ours existed on Earth in prehistoric times, or whether there were visits from people from other planets. Anyway, we published this book in Spanish last September, and it's called UPARTS. And it's been very interesting because everyone who's read it has said, wow, we didn't know that. For example, when we look at the crystal skulls are often touted as evidence of advanced technology in the past. But when you look into what's currently known about crystal skulls, their origin, how they were made, we find that most of them were fakes, or all of them really. Every single crystal skull that's known today were actual fakes made in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So we have to rule that out as evidence of advanced civilizations in antiquity. Then we look at all the other evidence presented by authors such as Zecharia Sitchin or Eric von Daniken, and we haven't found a single artifact which persuades us that there existed an advanced civilization in antiquity. We're still looking. We'd love to find one, but the book that we published is a guidebook to help people understand that these artifacts should be studied in the correct historical and archaeological context. And once you know something about how they originated, the peoples, for example, the Maya, the Aztec, the Olmec, the Toltec, the Egyptians, the early Europeans, and so on. Once you know something about their culture, we realize that these artifacts are not really as out of place as they seem. But in any case, the ancient astronaut theory is interesting. It started around 1823 in France. So the idea of the possibility that aliens have visited us in the past is fascinating. It's something that we've been speaking about culturally for almost 200 years now. So what we'd like to do is to translate this book and publish it in English in the near future as a guidebook to the artifacts seen on TV programs like Ancient Aliens.
Have you heard of a gentleman by the name of Michael Cremo?
Yes, I have. Michael Cremo and his I have 3 or 4 of his books. Yeah, Forbidden Archaeology. There's another book which discusses the media impact of Forbidden Archaeology. I think it's called Letters About Forbidden Archaeology or something like that, or the impact of Forbidden Archaeology. Then he has another book, I think, called Devolution, I believe it is. It's discussing his personal theories about what the evidence that he's found means. And he has another book on strange archaeology, which I downloaded from Kindle some time ago. And they're all very interesting. And he's absolutely right that the way that paleontological finds have been presented and analyzed isn't very fair. I mean, the evolution of the field hasn't been as linear as we would like. Some scientists have said, no, we won't accept this evidence. We prefer this evidence because it supports our theories better. So he's absolutely right that the field has developed in that way. However, he has a chapter there on UPARTS, and many of those artifacts we were able to show either weren't genuine or were just natural formations, and we published this in the book too. So unfortunately, none of the artifacts that he presents to show that there were advanced civilizations in the past seem to actually show that. But, you know, that book was published a long time ago now, Forbidden Archaeology, and the internet has given us a huge amount of new information that wasn't available then.
And have you heard about that? It was like a brick wall, basically, but the bricks were real shiny, and it was almost like a whitish tint that was found underneath coal deposits that were over 100 million years old
I
in
don't know
Oklahoma?
well, I don't know which case that was, so I'm going to say no, I don't. I have seen a lot of other stories about bricks, brick walls, strange walls, and so on, masonry found in geological strata, which seem completely impossible. Most of the time, there is a natural geological explanation for it, but if you know of an interesting case that I haven't seen so far, I'd love to have a look.
Definitely send that out to you. You know, I just think it's fascinating that you look at these structures like Machu Picchu, the Great Pyramids of Giza, and I just wonder how in the world did they put those things together so long ago? Not necessarily that it was an extraterrestrial, but just our own abilities back then seemed so much further in some levels than they are now.
Yeah, well, that is true. I mean, sometimes the level of expertise that they had at that time was greater than the level of expertise that some people have today. But it would also be incorrect to say that we couldn't build these things ourselves. It's interesting that there are so many theories about how the pyramids were built, and they're all quite good. You could build a pyramid with practically all of the theories that I've read about recently about how they made the blocks and put them into place and so on. We don't know which of these techniques they really used. I mean, there are some pictographic clues. You can find ancient Egyptian illustrations which seem to show how they pulled the blocks into place, but we don't know, which technique they used really. But it wouldn't be correct to say that we can't duplicate these monuments and these achievements because we found so many ways of doing it. I mean, most of the controversy about how the pyramids were built isn't about whether the Egyptians could have done it. It's about what technique they would have used. So, to some extent, it does seem that they had a really high level of knowledge and expertise in construction and architecture. But it didn't really surpass anything that we have today. One of the most important points when you assess the validity of an OOPArt, you have to ask yourself, does this object represent a level of technology or knowledge that did not exist at the time, in the period that it was found? We haven't found any examples of that yet. The first chapter of that book, actually, which I'd love to translate, goes into the topic of geological artifacts. For example, there are a lot of reports of nails and hammers and things like that found in geological strata, which would be millions or even hundreds of millions of years old if they were true. But what I've done over the last 6 or 7 years is to collect as many of those together as possible. And I think we're talking about 150 different reports now, and trying to see whether they were genuine or not. And if they were not genuine, why did newspapers constantly print stories about artifacts that didn't even exist? Because the fact is, practically none of these OOPArts have ever been seen or photographed or even drawn. They were mentioned in newspapers, like someone opens a rock or a piece of coal and a gold necklace came out. Well, we reached the conclusion that what happened was that in the 19th century, there was a lot of competition between the New World and the Old, between the North American intellectuals and European intellectuals, and they often competed for who's found the largest dinosaur bone and whose civilization made the greatest achievements in the past. And it was a kind of it was a question of national pride that the Europeans said, "Oh, our civilization goes back hundreds and thousands of years," and in North America they couldn't say the same because, of course, they looked at North American Indians and said, "Well, the people here weren't quite as advanced." So they came up with a lot of these stories just to compete with the Europeans at that period. There's a very good book called Fantastic Archaeology, which it was published by a university. I think it was Kansas. I'd have to look it up. They actually have a course on this subject where they teach the fact that American professors and American archaeologists and historians tried to compete constantly with their European counterparts, by saying, well, our dinosaur bones are bigger and our monuments are more fantastic. So I think a lot of the OOP arts that are so famous, the idea of finding a hammer or a nail inside a rock, probably came from that period. People were just inventing stories.
Well, you're taking all the fun out of that, Chris.
I'm sorry, but I'd love to find a real one. I challenge anyone to find a real one. I mean, seriously, I've always been fascinated by this subject. But what you really have to do at some point is to say, well, it is a lot more fun to say, there have been artifacts that have shown that our ancestors came from outer space, blah, blah, blah. But unless actual proof is found, presented, photographed, and so on, what are we talking about? We're just talking about possibilities, layered on to more possibilities. We're not really saying we have the proof of any of this. And we've really got to be driven by proof and evidence, not by our own wishful thinking. But I'd love if anyone listening to this can send me proof, evidence, something of an OOP art that they found. I'd be really happy to say we have a genuine one. That would be great.
And you've seen those old computers, right? That, I mean, not like a typical computer now, but they use kind of the same, I guess, overall essence of build or structure, where they found them on the bottom of the ocean and stuff, made out of several parts that can do calculations and such.
Yeah, the Antikythera machine. Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic because it's just full of this advanced clockwork. It basically, it's like a mini solar system, which shows. I mean, they actually use this to predict eclipses, the date of the Olympic Games, and so on. And it's fascinating. It used to be considered an OOP art when Eric von Daniken was publishing his books originally. He said, look, a computer from ancient Greece. But especially in the last few years, there have been, like, I don't know, dozens of documentaries and books published just about this, which show that it does have a very interesting but reasonable explanation. And it was simply because that's the kind of thing that they were developing in ancient Greece at the time. But there's an indication that this isn't really so advanced. The solar system of the Antikythera mechanism is one in which the Earth is the center of the solar system and the sun and the planets go around it. So really, it's just a child of its time. It's just proof that this was created by people who might have developed clockwork and machinery in this way. And it's wonderful. They made this wonderful astronomical instrument for predicting astronomical events, but really, they still believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. So it shows that it wasn't really built on advanced astronomical information, but certainly by an engineer who was way advanced, for his period.
What would you say your very favorite OOP art is?
Well, talking about OOP arts, we have found quite a lot. I'd say. Well, I'd probably say them for the wrong reasons, because one of my favorites was published by Zecharia Sitchin, I think in the 80s. It looks like a rocket, and it's in his books, and a lot of Zecharia Sitchin's followers still read this and say, wow, it looks exactly like a rocket. The idea is that it was probably Mesopotamian. At the back you see these like jet engines, and there's a guy wearing an astronaut suit, and it definitely is an astronaut suit. It seems to be made of rock, and it's in a museum, which is great. Unfortunately, the artifact is made of plaster, and it was probably made around the early 1970s. So when it was in a museum on display, people went there to visit the museum to say, wow, here's the rocket from Zecharia Sitchin's book. But then they had to remove it because nobody really understood that it was just an example of how a toy had become misinterpreted as an OOP art. So, I mean, that's one of my favorite cases, simply because it's an interesting story. But of an actual OOP art, haven't found one yet, which is why I'd like anyone to send me information about a good one.
Definitely, that'd be great. Have you also done any research into the cities that people are seeing in the sky now, where it's just like in China, I think they saw it, and also somewhere else, I can't remember.
Yeah, of course. There's a lot of information about that. It's fascinating because there's a very long tradition of people seeing soldiers battling in the sky, seeing cities in the sky, houses, and so on. And yeah, it's great that we've got this like video proof that this is possible. I'm not exactly sure what kind of mirage it is. I mean, it's definitely some kind of astronomical effect. It's been recorded, throughout history. So I don't exactly know what the cause of it is, but it's a wonderful mirage. It reminds me of when I was in Utah in 1990. I got on a Greyhound bus and I went all the way from Minneapolis to San Francisco. And as we were going through Utah, I could see the tops of the mountains reflected into the sky as a kind of mirage. It was an optical effect, I think, probably caused by the fact that Utah's just so full of salt. It wasn't a yellow desert, it was a white desert. I have this strong memory of that. And
check out any of the national parks out there, like Bryce Canyon or Zion?
I didn't get the chance. We just sped through Utah in a Greyhound bus. I didn't get to see any.
Bummer.
I didn't get to see much of it, but I was amazed that I could take photographs of the tops of the mountains reflected in the sky as if they were like little pyramids inverted and floating in the clouds. And I was so surprised that I could take actual photographs of a mirage. I would say that that's what the Chinese videos show. But there's a very long tradition of this, which is very interesting. And maybe one of the old stories in folklore or in mythology, when they talk about cities in the sky, places in the sky, who knows? Maybe they were referring to some alien planet where some being had come to visit us. From. I certainly don't believe that the Chinese videos show that. So I don't know what they show, but it's a great thing, isn't it? YouTube, you get to see things that you'd never normally see.
Oh, yeah. I mean, YouTube is great. I've had this channel now with youtube.com/clandestine time lord here at the Leak Project. And I mean, it's just grown at a very brisk pace. And it's nice to see. One of the things I like about YouTube is if you come up with good work, people watch your work, and if they have something that they would like to share, then they send you emails and information. I've talked to several people that have sent me pictures. I gotta get you in contact with a couple of these guys because I think you could use these pictures for your books. One person in particular, his name's Boris, and he looks like he's about 21. He's actually like 40-something years old, and he claims that he's he can make contact with ETs. And I was real skeptical at first because he would say stuff like, "Yeah, they just contact me, telepathically." He lives in the Bronx, which is a lot of people out there, and he'll go out during the day. I'm not joking, Chris. He's probably got 100 videos, and he'll go outside during the day and start recording in the sky. And what he does is he'll use a building as a reference point, and you'll see these lights that'll just show up, and they'll start changing colors and bouncing around. And 1 second it'll look like a metallic disc, and then it'll change into like this red orb, and then it'll look like a stick or something. It's just very strange.
Wow, sounds interesting.
Yeah. So that's one of the cool things about YouTube is you are able to collaborate so much information. And what do you think those things could possibly be?
Well, there's so many different explanations. I should preface this first by saying that on the 6th of April 1996, I myself saw a UFO. There's no other word for it, really. It was in a village called Talarrubias in Badajoz, which is a town, it's a province in Spain. And I came out of a house, and we were in a park and looked up, and there was a rectangular shape. Well, it looked like a bar of soap, and it was self-luminous. It was orange, very bright, and it wasn't even moving. It was just like there in the sky. And we're talking about rural Spain, 1996. There were no drones. There was nothing. It was just a very rural-looking place. And it was there for about 15 minutes, I'd say, and then it sort of disappeared suddenly, and it reappeared in a different part of the sky. So I then became a UFO witness myself. So the idea of looking up into the sky and seeing something that you can't identify, I've experienced that. I've never found an explanation for what I saw. I was with about 7 other people. We all saw it together. I was interested how people tried to explain it away. One person said, "Oh, that's at the top of a tower." And then, of course, when it disappeared and came back again in a different place, I said, "Yeah, I don't think they've just pushed the tower 5 kilometers in that direction," and so on. So I'm interested in how that happens. When the problem with the YouTube videos is, and I've had this experience before, analyzing cases, investigating, and I just want to say again that although I look at this in a very scientific way, I look at this from an academic point of view, I have had experiences myself myself, but I don't have any conclusions about what any of this means. And I don't mind, in fact, if what we're looking at are practically all psychological aberrations or whatever, or just natural phenomena. It doesn't bother me. I'm interested in all the mythology that surrounds all of this. Well, the problem with YouTube is that when you make a video of a light in the sky, any micro movement that you make with your hand makes that light move on the video. So it looks like what you're seeing is circular, it looks round. You make a very slight movement with a finger, which is, everyone does it. It's almost, unless you're using a tripod, you're never going to be completely still. Then suddenly that circular object looks long, it looks like a stick, it looks like a branch, and then it becomes round again. It seems to move or dance in the sky, but it's not really dancing. Your viewpoint is dancing, your viewfinder is dancing, your hand is trembling just very, very slightly. So the problem with YouTube videos is that it's very difficult to analyze what you see without knowing to what extent the person was moving the camera. But the same thing actually happens with the human eyesight, because a phenomenon called autokinesis makes things in the sky seem to dance around. So you're watching something, and it does seem to move from one point to another, maybe a distance that looks like even 2 meters long, or like 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. From our point of view, which of course from the point of view of an actual object in the sky could be hundreds of feet in either direction, but these are actually caused by like involuntary movements of the human eye. So certainly, there are lights in the sky that we don't understand, and I have no idea what they are, and I don't mind what they turn out to be. But it's difficult to say whether they truly do dance around and change shape and so on, because even if we try to look at them without the aid of binoculars, a telescope, or anything else, the human eye is susceptible to any kind of movement. So I don't know what it all means, but I do have about 200 or 300 years of cases of people reporting the same kind of thing, and sometimes very spectacularly. My group, Magonia Exchange, which I started in the year 2003 and still going strong, we've collected over 30,000 cuttings so far of UFOs mainly, and other kinds of phenomena. And these, among these 30,000 different things, I'm pretty sure that we found anomalies of some kind or another. And so if anyone listening to the program wants to find out about this group, if they come to my website at www.chrisaubeck.com, they can find a way to get to the webpage of the group, and they can start to receive copies of everything that passes through us, which is the ancient sightings, historical cuttings, and if they can contribute something themselves that they find online, fantastic, so we can build up this archive. So in about 10 years, I'm sure we'll reach about 100,000 items. So we're looking at the biggest archive of historical cases in the world easily.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you brought up Zecharia Sitchin and the Sumerian tablets, so I wanted to mention Nibiru, or Planet X, that Zecharia Sitchin talked about. There's this huge craze right now, not only on the internet, but even the mainstream news is starting to hit this, where there's sayings that we're reaching we're getting close to another orbitable path of a binary star system. And some people, once again, you've got plenty of pictures out there. I think about 99% of them you can explain away, but there's that 1% that I feel could possibly be genuine. And I'm still pretty neutral on this topic. But over the years that you've done research and all the files and cases that you've compiled together, besides Zecharia Sitchin and the Sumerian tablets talking about Nibiru, have you found any other correlations speaking about Planet X?
No, none at all, because I think that everything that Zecharia Sitchin wrote about this, he basically made up. So no, I haven't. Most of what's been published about Nibiru, about Marduk, the Anunnaki, and so on, it sprang from his work, starting with the 12th planet, but it isn't actually based on any real Sumerian texts and tablets. All of the translations that Zecharia Sitchin made are wrong. And so, I mean, you don't have to trust me on that these days, because the thing is, when Sitchin started publishing on this in the 1970s, he was using texts which practically nobody had any access to. We're talking about Sumerian translations of Sumerian texts into English or into any other language, which at the time would have been practically impossible for anybody to get in the 1970s, even 80s and 90s. But these days, all of these texts are available online. There's I don't remember right now the name of the webpage, but there they all are. Every single text ever translated is available. You go in there and you look for Nibiru, Anunnaki, and so on, and you discover very quickly that nothing that Sitchin wrote reflects reality at all. And he's been criticized for this, many, many times now. And even when he died, before he died, people were already saying to him, but you're not really a Sumerian scholar. You don't really read these things. And, since then, we all know about his life, his biography. He studied at the London School of Economics. He wasn't actually one of the few people in the world who could read these ancient languages. He said he was. He actually wasn't. So all of this talk about Nibiru and Anunnaki and so on that came from his books, I'm afraid it's not really true. So it's unlikely that I'd ever find anything, about this topic in ancient cases or mythology. It just isn't there.
And do you have actual evidence, though, to translate those so you can say without a shadow of a doubt that he was incorrect? Or are you just basing that based upon there is a lot of people out there that do say that he was a fraud, but the internet's a big place?
Oh, it's quite easy. As I said, anyone these days has access to the same sources that he used in his books. The first thing to point out really is that when he published The 12th Planet, he said that it was based on 30 years of research. The interesting thing is, and this is just a detail which I find interesting, I found a report in a newspaper from 1947 in which somebody, they didn't say who, had reached the conclusion that our ancestors came from outer space, from the 10th planet, and that information about all of this can be found in ancient Indian and Babylonian texts and similar things. And we're talking about someone who said that in 1947. There's no way that anyone could have reached that conclusion in 1947 because they wouldn't have had access to all of the ancient texts that Sitchin used to reach his conclusions. Basically, what this means is that the idea that our ancestors came from the 10th planet hundreds of thousands of years ago, and the evidence is out there in Sumerian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian sources, is a very old idea that didn't start with any foundation in evidence or fact at all. It was just something that someone said. And then, 3 years later, it seems that Zecharia Sitchin arrived in New York in 1950, and he also came up with the idea. I don't know whether there's a connection between these two people or whether they are the same person, but when he published the book 12th Planet in the 1970s, it seems that it wasn't the fruit of 30 years of investigation. This theory was already floating around out there. Then, as I said, all of the sources that he uses are now available. It isn't a question of looking up this on a web page and finding out whether he made it up or he was wrong, he was right, and so on. It's just a question of going to those very books. You can use Google Books and go to the same references that he used. You can go to the university websites and look at those exact texts translated by the same people that he used. It's not there. It's just not there. You can consult archaeologists and historians and so on. It's very unfortunate that his books sort of later were so popular in that way. People thought that he really was one of a handful of people who could read these languages. There really are only a handful of people in the world who can read cuneiform. He just wasn't one of them. It's just amazing to me that people still believe it. If you look at, he said that Nibiru passes every 3,600 years.
Yes.
Well, if you calculate this, and I did at the time, and I actually wrote to him. I was like 17 years old. I wrote him a letter, and I said, well, the thing is, in the year 200, I think it was 200 AD, it could be 200 BC, I'll have to look it up, there was nothing. There were no visits. There was no planet in the sky. There was nothing. How is it possible that when you calculate it and you look at the last passage of Nibiru, there was nothing there? And he didn't have an answer to that. And I don't know. It's all I don't know. It's sort of hard to put it in words without offending lots of people who believe in his books. But honestly, you look into his sources, you look into his life, and everything else. There's really nothing there. It's a shame that people spend so much of their time looking into mysteries that really aren't mysteries, because the world is full of fascinating mysteries and enigmas. Why dwell on ones that have already been ruled out and rejected? But so no, I'm not using web pages to reach that conclusion. I'm talking about that using the same sources and references that he did. I mean, Nibiru, basically, it's a term of the equinox, and I mean, it's been related to planets and things, but it's got nothing to do with what Zacharias says in his books. So yeah, this was debunked many years ago. But I mean, the family of Zacharias Sitchin is still pumping out this newsletter, as far as I know, in which they every month or so they publish unpublished writings of Zacharias Sitchin, and I don't see why people are still so credulous that they still follow it and they still believe in all of this. The information's out there, and I'm not talking about going to skeptical web pages. Just go to the sources that this guy used, that Sitchin allegedly used. It doesn't talk about rockets, and it doesn't talk about any of this. He didn't know how to translate things from the Akkadian, the Sumerian. He didn't know how to read cuneiform. I did read of someone who said to him, "Can you read this?" And he didn't reply. He didn't bother. It's a bit like when Lobsang Rampa, the third eye guy, who was very famous in the 1950s and 60s, and still today there are a lot of people who read the books of Lobsang Rampa thinking he was a real Tibetan mystic. And he was unmasked, 40 years ago, I think, as the son of an English plumber. He worked in I think it was a corset factory or something like this, and he just came up with this story that he was a Tibetan mystic. And when he was introduced to a real Tibetan man, I don't know who it was, but a real person from Tibet, and put into a situation in which they would have a conversation. Of course, he didn't understand a word, because his name was Cyril Hoskins, son of an English plumber. And Zacharias Sitchin's a very similar case. The difference is that Lobsang Rampa was publishing books in a period before the internet, so he didn't have this amazing reach that Sitchin has had over the last 2 decades. These days, you have Sitchin everywhere. I mean, I think his ideas have become part of literature and science fiction, and it's all over the place. Other people in the past weren't as lucky. They didn't have the same media exposure as he had.
You probably studied the Vedic text, correct?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I don't know them off by heart and whatever, but yeah, I know a lot about them, I suppose. Yeah.
Because some of the pictures and some of the descriptions there, it almost seems as if they are spaceships.
Yeah, that's true. Are you talking about the Vimanas or?
Yes.
Or right. Well, the Vimanas are very interesting, because we're talking about ancient legends of objects that floated in the sky, which were palaces and cities and chariots and so on. But the one which a lot of people come up with constantly is one called the Vaimanika Shastra, which is it's a text in Sanskrit. And if you look at the pictures, I imagine you've seen the same ones. They look like the sort of airships that were floating around at the end of the 19th century, where they sort of have wings and tails and so on. And they're very interesting technical diagrams of these objects, of these Vimana. The problem with all of these, and I know that they've been published in books by quite well-known authors like Childress, I think, and I don't know, practically everyone who writes about this. The thing is, the Vaimanika Shastra, this Sanskrit text, is actually a 20th century creation. It didn't exist before the 20th century. It was revealed mystically and magically by a guy called G.R. Joshua in 1952, which was well into the flying saucer period. So you have to be very careful when we're talking about Vimana, because the very ancient, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, these old books certainly describe floating cities and chariots. But you've got to be very careful with this subject, because firstly, a lot of those old texts, the genuinely old ones, said that these chariots in the sky were being pulled by horses. I mean, the idea that you can accept that it was a vehicle in the sky, but then you've got to say, no, well, they must have invented the bit about the horses. That's sort of bias, isn't it? It's sort of selective bias. We don't. It's a mental trap that you might fall into. But all of the really good pictures of Vimana and descriptions of Vimana, they're from the 1950s. These were alleged channeled texts. They're not genuinely ancient. So you have to be very careful when you talk about Vimana, which is the same as in this book called Uparts. We looked at the evidence for ancient nuclear warfare, and there are some really great articles floating around Facebook, the internet, talking about passages of the Mahabharata, which seem to describe the fall of a nuclear weapon and the destruction from it, and they don't exist. We were very surprised to discover this. You start comparing the original text to that, and you discover that basically this all comes from some joke that was published in a magazine in the early 1990s. The alleged scientist who said, yes, it looks like a nuclear bomb. This guy was born 100 years before that, and they use his name as an alleged expert. So you've got to be very careful when we look at ancient texts, because not everything is as it seems.
You've brought a different approach to many topics that have been discussed for years. And I mean, some of these topics kind of go off on their own little creation, like you say, and with as powerful as the internet is, you can put two things together and that don't even have anything to do with what the discussion is supposed to be about. And then you can come up with a completely new topic, So, wow, it's fascinating. And for those that have had an opportunity to listen to this show, check out Chris's work, chrisaubeck.com, author of Return to Magonia, Wonders in the Sky, Uparts, and you've also got a new book coming out in June. Can't wait to get the English version of that. So what's next for you, Chris?
Well, I'm working on different projects at the moment. I've been working on a thesis the last 8 or 9 years discussing the history of alien visitation claims from around 1847 to 1947. So this is going to be the biggest study there's ever been about claims of visiting aliens in the past. Again, I'm not ruling out that this has happened. I'm not saying it has or hasn't happened, but I'm looking at every single claim that's ever been that people have visited us. And I'm looking at cases from the 1840s, which seem to parallel Roswell in a way, because they're talking about artificial objects which crash landed on Earth, which even in the middle of the 19th century, people were saying probably came from another planet. So I'm looking at all of these stories together, and I'll publish this as soon as I've finished it, I suppose. I'm also looking at, I'm also finishing a book now on, there's a topic here in Spain, which is, and it's in the world too in general, but it's about mysterious images that appear on walls, faces and things like ghostly images. I'm doing a massive history of that topic, and so I'll be publishing that in the next few months. And other things, mysterious disappearances and whatever. I mean, some disappearances are truly mysterious, some are not, but people think that they are. Like I published a very interesting article with Theo Pijmans, a Dutch researcher, in Fortean Times recently, and we look at the origins of the Oliver Lurch story, and we're discussing the possibility of writing a book full of these cases. I'm also discussing with Fortean Times, publishing a regular series of articles with Martin Schoff, looking at at all of Charles Fort's cases, every single one from the beginning, analyzed properly, going back to the sources, looking at all the scientific possibilities and saying which were really anomalous and which weren't. And hopefully we'll get that started in Fortean Times in the near future. So many things going on, because there's just so much information out there, which is why I get really annoyed when people get obsessed with these mysteries that are not mysteries. They were rejected years ago. Let's get on with the real ones, the good ones, and find better ones, because we don't want to be bogged down with what mystified and confused and bewildered our grandparents and our parents. We want to find new stuff, the good stuff. So I don't know, constantly researching and looking for answers.
Well, Chris, I got to tell you, it's great to have you on the show. I certainly hope we can speak again when you get that new book put together. I'd like to hear more about that. Folks, check out chrisaubeck.com. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leap Project. I am your host, Rex Baer, and tonight we have guest Chris Aubuck with us, author, researcher, and aerial phenomena expert. Mr. Aubuck has authored 3 books on the subjects of UFOs and out-of-place artifacts. Back in 2003, Chris co-founded a remarkable collaboration network of librarians, students, and scholars of paranormal history on the internet. Extends from North and Central America to Russia and Germany. It has accumulated thousands of references, searched media archives in several languages, and gathered hundreds of rare documents, scientific reports, and newspaper clippings from the last 400 years. Authoring Return of Magnolia, Wonders in the Sky, and Ooparts, tonight we will be discussing much of the UFO phenomenon that's taken place over the past few hundred years. We're going to get into personal experiences and eyewitness accounts. Chris brings forth a thought-provoking, paradigm-shattering presentation. Now, Chris is working on a new book that's coming out late June in Spanish, and it's going to be on teleportation, time travel, and some other really cool phenomenon. So you can find Chris and his work at www.chrisaubeck.com. Hey, it's great to have you on the show with us here at the Leak Project, Chris. How's it going?
Hey, hi. Very well. And how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Just really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you. I've gone through your books, and you've just got so much information out there. And I like how you compiled data over the past several hundred years, because a lot of people just kind of focus on the past, I would say 60, 70 years ever since Roswell. And there's so many things out there around the world that point to, space travel, UFOs, flying saucers. So definitely going to get into this. But if you would, real quick for us, Chris, just give us a little description about yourself and why you decided to go down this path.
Okay, well, I'm English. I was born in London. I moved to Spain at the age of 19, and I've been here ever since. I'm currently living in the south of Spain, where I don't have a job, but that does mean that I'm able to research more ancient cases and to do some more investigation into what mainly interests me, which are very old UFO cases, anything from 1947 and before, plus archaeological mysteries. I've always been very interested in those. And my perspective on all of this is really that of a historian of the field. I'm not so bothered whether I'm looking at real data, real cases, actual UFOs, and so on. I'm more interested in the sociological impact that all of this has had over the decades, because in fact, if you look back in time at the topic of ancient astronauts, for example, we've been talking about the possibility that aliens visited the Earth since the early 19th century. And the idea that UFOs could be extraterrestrial in origin has been discussed since the middle of the 19th century too. So what I'm interested in is looking at the roots of ufology, the roots of other Fortean phenomena, including archaeological anomalies, and just trying to see what impact that has had on people.
If you were to look at all the data and evidence that you've got with UFOs, how far back are one of the oldest pieces of evidence that points to flying saucers?
Well, we have to distinguish, of course, between flying saucers and UFOs, which are very different animals indeed. But the earliest stories about unidentified flying objects, you can find them even in Sumerian texts. You can find them in cuneiform on tablets from Mesopotamia, because they discuss, or at least they catalog certain kinds of astronomical anomalies, such as dark meteors. We all know that meteors are very bright-looking things that fly across the sky. The idea that one of them could be dark, or we could think there goes a black one late at night, is a strange concept. So that would technically be a UFO. It would be an unidentified flying object, and we're talking about 5,000 years ago. But if we look back to the earliest Roman chronicles, some Greek writings, and then, of course, later on in the medieval period, we find that scribes were constantly making note of strange things that they saw in the sky, which, of course, they said were visions or omens of God's anger, or maybe because God supported a side in a war, in a battle situation. He was indicating this with some kind of sign in the clouds. So it's a very old subject, and it doesn't matter which period in history you look at, you can normally find some indication that people were confused by things that they saw in the atmosphere. It doesn't always mean that these were UFOs in the sense that we hope they exist today as extraterrestrial or interdimensional objects, but it certainly indicates that people have always been obsessed with this subject going back thousands of years.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because there is certainly a difference between flying saucers and UFOs. And that was one of the reasons I asked that question. We had Stanton Friedman on here a while back. He was the first civilian investigator for Roswell. And I did bring up UFOs with him once. He said, well, let's make sure we're talking about the right thing. You know, flying saucers are completely different from UFOs. So I'm definitely glad you mentioned that. Now, I have seen old Renaissance paintings that looks like there's flying saucers in them. You know, not just UFOs, but actually disc-shaped, spaceship-looking things. Have you noticed the same anomalies?
Well, there are Renaissance paintings. There are a lot of religious paintings which seem to depict flying saucers or UFOs of some kind. However, none of these cases really interest me, or they're not really cases. This is the problem. We're looking at depictions of, normally it's religious symbols. We're normally talking about something that had its own artistic evolution. If you look back in time at how these objects, why they were painted into religious pictures, you normally find that they were stylistic versions of an eye, or of a circle of angels, or just a halo, something like that. So I don't really trust who talk about UFOs in ancient religious paintings, because once you look at the origin of these symbols, or of these depictions, you realize there's nothing really ufological about them. There's a very good web page by an Italian art expert called Duochi, I think his name is. I don't remember how to spell it. I'll look that up. And he goes into great detail talking about the explanation for these supposed anomalies in religious paintings. And I would recommend anyone to check out his website. So I personally don't believe that religious paintings have anything to do with UFOs.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I've definitely seen some pictures that make me go, wow, that looks like a flying saucer or some type of disc-shaped thing. But I can see what you're saying. One of the things, too, that I found interesting with some of these old Renaissance paintings was, like, for one, as an example, Jesus is on the cross, and then on each side of them, there's these, what looks like, you know, little like discs or spaceships or something like that. And then I saw this one painting of this lady was like inside of her house or whatever doing something, and then there's this disc-shaped anomaly that's got a beam that literally goes directly to her. So I mean, that's kind of why I put that connection there, but I haven't done enough research into the religion, shapes and symbols and such. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Let me just let me just tell your listeners that the web page which I'm referring to, it was built by this art expert, and he's also interested in ufology. He's an Italian researcher called Diego